Well, welcome everyone in person and online. Thank you for joining us for the dissertation defense of Robert Bischoff. The committee, Robert's PhD committee, consists of myself as his chair, Dr. Michael Barton, and Dr. Michelle Hegman, who is remote calling in today as well. So Robert, he's going to talk a little bit about his academic history in the presentation as well, but he comes to us via Utah State to Brigham Young to hear Utah Valley. I'm sorry, Utah Valley to Brigham Young to ASU here. And I first met Robert in 2017 at that wasn't the first time we met. That's the first time we sort of like had a longer conversation, I guess, at a workshop that I hosted at the Computer Applications Archaeology meeting in Georgia. It was Georgia, right? That year?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And Robert was a participant in that workshop that was focused on network uncertainty metrics. And, right away I was like, oh, this guy knows what's going on. So like when he applied for graduate school here, I was excited to have him come on board. And he's developed, a profile as a computational archaeologist. And since he's been here at ASU, he's been actively involved in lots of different projects. He's published in Kiva, including award-winning Hayden Prize paper in Journal of Archaeological Science Reports, Journal of Anthropological Archaeology, and also journals like PeerJ, Computer Science, and things like that. So also sort of outside of the field of archaeology. And Robert's, got a huge skill set in sort of methodological exploration and computational archaeology in particular, which is something near and dear to my own heart as well. But I'm really excited for him to tell us a little bit about his research, which is focused on sort of some of those network methods and methodological explorations in archaeology in the Southwest in general. In addition to the archaeological work that Robert's done, he's currently working for us as a digital data specialist senior, I think is your official title, for the Center for Archaeology and Society. So we're happy to have him on board there, and happy that he's going to continue on with us, at least for the time being, until he moves on to something else. But yeah, so Robert, it's been a pleasure working with you, and we're excited to have your presentation today. And so Robert's going to give us a presentation on his research, what his dissertation has been focused on over the last several years. And this is a National Science Foundation funded project, funded by a DDRI grant. And then he's going to say a little bit about kind of the future of his research and where he's hoping to go with it as well. So he'll give a presentation, and then we'll have questions from the committee and then questions from the audience. And I'll be kind of managing the online questions. If you have them, you can type them in the chat towards the end of the presentation, and I'll be able to manage that there. Or you can, if you have a microphone and you'd like to speak, please use the raise hand function after the talk, and I'll kind of manage who's there doing that and things like that. Then after we do all that, the committee will deliberate and we'll send kind of everybody out of the room, and we'll put all the remote people in a breakout room for a minute. We'll talk about the details of the process and what we want Robert to do to finish up his thing, and then we'll bring you up all back in for the end of the defense there. So please, if you when we send you out, don't go far away. We'll bring you back in shortly. So any other technical details I'm missing? Michael, I think that's okay. So without further ado, we'll let Robert come and tell us a little bit more about his research. Thank you. Action, I appreciate it. Okay. So, it's a good introduction. So I'll tell a little bit more about my past, including indeed the actual moment we met was pivotal to this storyline for a couple of reasons. I'm going to describe that, and then talk about the overview of what the heck I'm doing here. And then there's three parts to my dissertation. There's ArcMatNet, an agent-based model. I'll describe what an agent-based model is in a little bit more detail. Later on, there's a projectile point analysis. There's a multi-layer network analysis, which I'll also describe what a multi-layer network is. And then there's a wrap-up, and then there's what's going on in the future. So I took my first college class in 2006, very, very long time ago. Did one semester at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Then I took a little break, and that describes some of the
details here. But while I was getting my master's degree, I attended my first archaeological conference, the Southwest Symposium in Tucson. And the first person that one of my BYU professors introduced me to was right here, Dr. Matt Peebles. And I said, I really admire this network research you're doing. What are you using to generate the networks? And he said, I'm using R. And I had no idea what he was talking about. Not the slightest idea. And if you don't know what R is, please see me afterwards and I will talk to you as long as you can stand it. It's a programming language. I use it for most of my analysis, and I wrote my dissertation in R. I went a little bit overboard from that one conversation, so it was quite pivotal. And then indeed attended that network workshop where there was a polar vortex and I froze in Atlanta, quite surprisingly. But at Brigham Young University, there was also another instrumental event, and that was I was asked to do a projectile point analysis, which led me to do further projectile point research. And that's because I really didn't like the projectile point analysis, not because I didn't like projectile points, I do. It's because the analysis consisted of looking at reference images and then comparing the projectile point to those reference images and seeing what's the best match. Well, that's not a terrible way to do things, but I was unsure of myself, and whenever I was really unsure, I'd go ask somebody with more experience. He would do the exact same thing. I thought there has to be a better way than this. And that was kind of the genesis of a lot of the research I'm doing. But there's also something else I noticed, and that was in the region I was studying, the Fremont region in Utah, the ceramic distribution spatially and the projectile point distributions didn't overlap very much. And so that made me wonder, what if the social networks are different? And so these ideas helped me formulate my dissertation research that I will present here. So when I first read about the Southwest Social Networks Project, which Matt was a part of, network analysis was just starting to gain real traction in archaeology, and it didn't take long for it to take off in a big way. It's becoming more common and more popular all the time. And for those of you who aren't familiar with network analysis, let me give you a quick overview. It's both a visual and a quantitative way of studying systems made up of nodes and ties. Nodes can represent anything: people, places, artifacts. Ties are the relationships or connections between them. And that flexibility makes network analysis incredibly powerful, but it also means we have to be careful. We have to understand exactly what kind of network we're working with and what its structure allows us to infer. As the network can be anything, doesn't necessarily mean that we interpret a network the same way as any other network. In archaeology, we typically use a branch of this field called social network analysis, which focuses on the relationship between people or groups. These relationships can take many forms. They can be trade, marriage, shared ritual, and more. But we usually just summarize them as interactions between social entities. Here's the challenge. Unlike sociologists, who can actually observe the interactions between people, the archaeologists cannot. But what we can do is we can use material culture, things like ceramics, architecture, projectile points, and we can build networks based on the similarities in these objects between the entities that we're studying. And we can use these as proxies of interaction or as a probability that interaction may have occurred. And these are known as material culture networks, or often referred to as archaeological similarity networks. And then that brings us to the core question of this dissertation, the overarching question, which is, what is the relationship between material culture networks and actual social networks or interaction networks between people? So on the left in this diagram, you have a network between people groups. And on the right, we have a network between pots, types of pots. And this is just a visual representation of that question. And we assume this is a fundamental question in archaeology without networks. What does the material and culture tell us about the past? But more so specifically in networks, what is the real meaning between the strength of that relationship and the strength of the interaction in a network approach? Also, as I mentioned, there were differences between the projectile points and the ceramic distributions. Two different types of material culture create different types of networks. What about the differences in attributes of material culture? How do those relate to the networks? Of course, there's a really big challenge, and that's we don't know what the original social network was in archaeology. One approach I looked at to address this problem was an ethnographic network. But when I approached this problem, there weren't any suitable data sets that I could find to address this. However, a couple of years ago, Archaeology published a paper asking essentially the same question that I'm asking, which is great because I've been scooped and my dissertation question has been answered. Maybe. Well, let's see what he did. So he took bone daggers from New Guinea and he analyzed them and he created a material culture data set and he created a matrix, which is the similarity between various villages in Papua New Guinea. And so he has a material culture network between bone dagger similarity. And then he looked at the villages and he calculated the probability that interaction existed. And then he used this to determine whether the network distance between villages predicted material culture similarity. And there was some correlation in some way. Network distance did predict material culture similarity. So there's some validity. It wasn't super strong, but there was some validity for using network analysis. However, one measure we use to quantify networks is a centrality measure. And a centrality measure measures the position and structure that a node has in the network. So how it influences the network, how the network influences the node. There's many ways to do that, but all of the measures he tried didn't really work out very well for predicting the material culture network compared to the interaction network. Well, one of the problems though with this network, and this is a great study and excellent work, but based on the data that was available to him, he could only do binary ties between villages. It's either a tie exists or it does not exist. But in reality, most of the time we're looking at the strength of interaction, and that's how material culture similarities work. We have one for complete similarity between networks, and then we have 0 for no similarity at all. There's no similarity between these two sites. So a binary tie doesn't quite capture that. Do you visit a village once or twice or frequently, a ton of times? That's more of a comparison. And since that information wasn't available, it makes it a little bit more challenging to do this study. So if we can't find a suitable database, then we'll make one instead. And for that, we'll use an agent-based model. An agent-based model is a computational method to simulate the interaction between agents who are given a set of behavioral rules. And these agents follow the rules each step of the model. So each time step, they follow their instructions and they interact with other agents. And through this interaction, emergent behavior develops. And what makes this emergent behavior is it's complex and it's hard to predict from the rules that you give it initially. So that's one tool that you use to develop a data set. And I'll explain that a little bit more later. But throughout this dissertation, I used several other methods. One is GIS, which many are familiar with, to spatially analyze the data. And then we'll use geometric morphometrics, which I will explain a little bit more later. Machine learning, which was primarily used just to save me some time, and to make the data more reproducible for future work. And then I've already described network science. So this research has a variety of methods used, but let's dig into the agent-based model a little bit more. So we have the ArcMatNet agent-based model, short for Archaeological Material Networks, and it has 3 papers published so far using ArcMatNet. It was written and developed by my colleagues at ASU, Claudine Gravel and Gale, and at the university, formerly the University of Zurich, now of the University of Cambridge, Cecilia Padilla Iglesias. So how does it work? Well, first off is the development of it. I work with small-scale horticulturalists in the Southwest. My colleague Cecilia works with modern African hunter-gatherers, and Claudine works with Paleolithic hunter-gatherers. So we have kind of a variety of backgrounds. So we wanted to develop an abstract model that was applicable in a variety of situations. And what it does is it simulates long-term complex interactions between agents. And we record the interactions between agents to create a social network. And they also generate material culture that we can use to create material culture networks that we can compare the two. It gives us a controlled environment where we can more explicitly address this question. So it was built in NetLogo, which is one of the more commonly used platforms for creating agent-based models. The idea was to, again, create a flexible model, but one that has a lot of parameters, which I'll show in a moment, just giving you an idea of what was going on, in order to create really complex social networks so that we didn't have a very simplistic model that we could compare. Each time step in the model represents 1 month. So in that case, we decided that everybody could reach every other location within the model inside a month. So everybody just teleports there and back because of that long time period. And everybody lives in a camp. The camp doesn't move around. You just live in one camp. And you also belong to a band. This would be similar in a village setting to a village that has a larger community that's attached to, which is very common in the Southwest and many other areas. And so you interact most frequently with people in your own camp. You see them every day, you interact with them every day. You interact next most with people in the same band, but you occasionally also interact with, you'll have friends with, or go visit with people in other bands as well. So it's a hierarchical structure with decreasing frequencies of interaction. And what do you do all day? Well, you make stuff. For one, you make pots, you make lights. And how do you make them? Well, you have your own style of making something. You have a style that you are assigned based on your camp, and this depends on a certain parameter. Either every camp has its own unique style, or everybody has the exact same style. So it's either one or the other. But you can learn new styles. You can learn through prestige or through conformism. Prestige cultural transmission involves finding the person nearby who is the most prestigious, and you learn what they do. Now, prestige depends on the pot or the point, and this is one of the big differences between the material culture. For a pot, it's randomly assigned. Some potter is assigned at the beginning of the model to be the most prestigious. You learn from them. But for points, it depends on the environment, because when you go hunting, if your point is more adapted to that particular environment, and there could be several environments, you're more likely to be successful. And take the average of those successful hunts, and that's how prestigious you are. But conformism, the other way, is you take the average or the mode of the most common style around you, and you learn that style. So there's a difference way, and usually it's not either prestige or conformism. The default is to have a mix of them. That's randomly assigned. And so every month you have the opportunity to visit friends you've made or to make new friends, to hunt with people from your own band, and that's limited to within band only, to trade with others and to learn from them. And as you're doing all of these things, sometimes your pots break as they do. Sometimes your points break as they do, and they get dropped, thrown away, and that creates the material culture record. So that's the primary output of the model is the material culture record recorded for each camp, and then the interactions between each individual, except we only have the material culture by camp, and archaeologically, we don't have really a lot of individual records. So we aggregate the interaction counts by camp as well. And you can see not the details of all of the parameters, but that there are a lot of parameters you can control in some model. So you can simulate a wide variety of conditions. This complexity makes it hard to figure out exactly how one parameter affects the model, but what it does allow us to do is just generate these complex interactions that we're looking for. So what are the results? Well, first off, I need to mention that because there are so many parameters, you have to run the model a lot of times. Second thing is there's a lot of randomness involved, whether you go hunting and who you go hunting with, who you visit, when you visit, all of these things are controlled by random values. And because of that randomness, you want to make sure that your run of the model isn't just some outlier. So you have to run the model a lot of times. Model takes a lot of time to run. We usually run it for 4,000 steps. And so what do you need to do this? You need a supercomputer. So my thank you to Research Computing for Arizona State, their sole supercomputer. We ran over 30,000 runs of the model, generate a lot of data. What we have here is a correlation comparison between the different types of networks. This can be thought of as a network equivalent to a Pearson correlation, where 1 is complete correlation, -1 would be completely oppositely correlated. So all the way to the left, we have visiting and trading. So these are not material culture compared to interaction networks, but just as an example, you see that the visiting and trading networks and the visiting and learning and trading and learning, those are all very similar to each other. But when we look at the material culture versus the interaction networks, they're not quite as strong, but above 0.75 on average, very strongly correlated. And the point and pot networks over here, third from the right, similar values. And then if we combine all of the visiting and trading and learning networks and the hunting as well, which are not shown because you only hunt within your own band, so it tends to skew the networks. If you combine all of those, you get basically the same results as well for the points and the pots. And the results are very good. A couple of caveats, though. One, you see a lot of outliers. Some of these are for particular parameters, like frequent migration can throw things off, but sometimes it's just randomness. So that's something important to remember is that random encounters, random chance can throw off your models, but it's rare, but something to keep in mind. The second is that all of this data is ran with one particular parameter, all of the values that are shown. And that's with every camp has a unique starting trade. These values do not show any runs where every camp has the same starting trade. The reason for that, I will show in just a moment. That makes the biggest difference. So keep that in mind. First, though, we're going to look at some of the other parameters. And these, again, are all ran with camps that have different starting traits. So we can see that aggregation frequency makes a big difference. Aggregation is when everybody in the same band comes together for a big party or whatnot for a month, one-time step of the model. And the more frequently you get together, the stronger your correlation is. So the more likely you are to interact. The less frequently you interact, the weaker the correlation. So interaction really drives correlation. Learning method has an interesting pattern where 0 is complete conformism, 100 is complete prestige, and 50 would be an even chance of learning by prestige or conformism. And we see that a mixed model does best. It's more likely to correlate well with the social networks and the material culture networks. Well, I wanted to investigate this further and see if that what the cultural transmission literature has to say on that. And it says exactly what this says. It says that if your cultural transmission is entirely prestige-based, then what happens is you're always picking the most prestigious person and doing what they do, and culture tends to kind of run off an adaptiveness that is not stable enough and it has harmful effects on society. On the other hand, if everybody just does what everybody else does, your society can't adapt, so it tends to struggle and fail. Now, that isn't really built into this model, so it's not capturing those dynamics in this model, but it is capturing something else, and it's interesting that they correlate with each other. So I think that's an interesting topic for future research, is to see why this model returns the same results that we would see for traditional examinations of cultural transmission methods. In addition, the longer you run the model, the less likely the networks are to be correlated. And then if there's artifact visibility on, there is less correlation. We haven't talked about artifact visibility yet, so we will discuss that in a moment. First, I did rearrange these slides, I thought, but it didn't save. So we're going to look at a couple of runs of the model. So on top, we have 5 networks: visiting, learning, trading, point, and pot. And the top model is ran with everybody having the exact same styles. So the visiting, learning, trading, the colors all represent camps belonging to the same band. So we can see that there's very tight clusters. You can't even see the ties barely. There's huge blue bands because all of the bands, camps in the same band, interact very strongly with each other. But they're all quite similar. These are only showing the strongest 50% of ties. But if you look at the point and the pot network, and actually that little network in the middle, the 15, 8, 10, 14, 16 is part of the pot network. It's just a big jumble. And this is kind of what we see sometimes in material culture networks for archaeology. But it's hard to separate what's going on. There are some patterns. You see, like in the point network, the yellow is kind of together, the grains are kind of together. So we do see a little bit of clustering, but it's really hard to make out. It's not very good. And it doesn't really match very closely to what's going on in the other networks. But if we jump down to the lower network, if every camp has their own unique style, then we get very similar picture to the original interaction networks. So what this means is that the more distinct the material culture is, the more likely you are to get strong correlations. And so that's the biggest takeaway from the ArcMatNet agent-based model, is that distinctiveness in material culture is essential for accurately reconstructing social networks for material culture. Now, some of the individual ties between camps belonging to different bands show differences. And so some of those weaker links are not as clear. And so I would say focus more on the strong links in your network interaction. There are also a lot of differences between the points and the pots. You see that green and purple have a connection for the point, but there's no connection between the pots. So at an individual level, there's more differences between the point and the pot networks. So let's go back to what I talked about with visibility. So there's this concept for material culture called artifact visibility. And it's really important for understanding a lot of things about material culture, but how it relates to networks is this. If an artifact has a highly visible attribute, it's easy to copy. If I have a pot, a bowl, with painted designs around the outside, and I hold it up, everybody in the room can see those designs. And if you are somewhat artistic, unlike me, has to use a computer to do anything with art at all, you can copy those designs and you can make something similar. But if I held up a pot and you're standing across the room, you probably couldn't tell if it was made via paddle and anvil or via snake coil method. You wouldn't be able to tell some of the construction methods unless you were maybe really talented, much better than I could possibly be. It's hard to see some of those low visibility attributes like the construction methods, the interior details. You might not be able to see what's inside of the wall of a house, footings look like. So these are things that you'd have to observe during construction while something's being made. So you can think of a lot of low visibility attributes as things that you'd observe is part of a community of practice, or maybe more distantly a constellation of practice where you're observing what's happening or you're being taught by somebody who is taught by somebody else. So these are indicative of actual interaction, whereas you can just see something from afar as you walk by, like, oh, I like that, I'm going to copy that. So that's the difference between high visibility and low visibility. So how it works in a network is, for example, if you have frequent interaction between node A and node B, and you have high visibility attribute, you're likely to see high similarity between artifacts between A and B. But for low visibility attributes, it might not show up as strongly. You might see just a moderate similarity. Between B and C, where there's common interaction, you might only see moderate similarity for the high visibility, but low visibility or low similarity for the low visibility attribute. And between C and A, where there's not much interaction, you see a little bit for the high visibility, but you might not see anything at all for low visibility attributes. So it's this fuzzier picture. And so visibility definitely affect how well you can interpret the network. So that's something to think about when you're interpreting your network analysis. What's the attribute that I'm looking at, and how visible is this attribute? So to summarize, what we've learned from ArcMatNet is the correlation between networks is strong but variable if you have a strong difference in the material culture. If you don't, then you have to be very cautious and only use the strongest of relationships between nodes. Also, the material culture strengths are a lot fuzzier than the social interaction networks, so they might not seem as strong as the interaction networks were, or they might seem a little bit stronger than they were. So it kind of goes both ways. It just tends to have a smoothing effect sense. And there are some differences in the networks for the different types of artifacts, between the points and the pots in this case. And there are various behaviors that can affect the ways that the networks correlate with each other. So let's skip ahead to the projectile point analysis. This consisted of 3,114 points from 81 sites. You can see the region here. This is a corner of northeast Arizona and northwest New Mexico. This is the Four Corners area. So we have sites that range from the Sinagua area, or Flagstaff, down to one site in the Phoenix Basin, sites just northeast of that in the Tonto Basin around Roosevelt Lake, up to the Zuni area, the Hopi area, and many sites in between. These sites range from AD 1100 to AD 1500. There's some tremendous social changes that happen at this time. Major migrations, huge social aggregation. You go from many, many smaller sites to a handful of really massive sites. And that's the state that the Southwest was in when the Spanish arrived shortly after the end of the time period I'm discussing. I just want to give you an example of some of the projectile points that are in my study. I couldn't fit them all in here, but I wanted to show some of them for reasons. But I excluded any points I identified as atlatl dart points or quarter notch points. Those predate my study. But there's a large variety. Many of them are broken, so I had to account for that in my study as much as possible. And I use what I mentioned earlier is geometric morphometric analysis. So geometric morphometric is a series of methods to quantitatively analyze shape. There's two major branches. One is the landmark analysis, and two can be called outline analysis. Often it is used, often we use elliptical Fourier analysis, which is complex, but essentially you translate the shape into a series of coefficients that you can analyze in multivariate space, just like you can analyze the landmarks. So what I did for the landmark analysis, I used both elliptical Fourier analysis and landmark analysis, is I adapted the process to work with broken points. So I took only 1/4 of the projectile point and placed landmarks around the point. For side notch points, I also included 3 points around the notch. I eliminated those for triangular points. And you can see for triangular on the right and for side notch points on the left, the small dots are the positions of each individual projectile point, and the large dots are the average locations of each landmark. But there's a big problem with this analysis. Something Michael Barton has discovered on his own a few years before I did, and that's the continuous variation across the morphometric space of projectile points. So I wanted to project these across space and see nice little tight clusters that I could assign to types. But as you can see, it's just a continuous spread of points. And if you look, you can see these points are really similar and they're right next to each other. That's good. Those ones are similar, they're right next to each other. So the nearer the points are to each other, the more similar they are, but there's no break in the data. It's just continuous variation. It's almost as if the points just morph into each other. So what do we do? How do we handle that situation? Well, one thing we can do is to use the geometric morphometric analysis and some of the original typological classifications used to build a typology, and we can use those attributes to create a typology. And so that's what I did with this decision tree. Is I use geometric morphometrics to divide the points somewhat arbitrarily into 3 shape clusters. I determined the shape of the base, whether it was side notch or triangular. There are almost no side notch points that were serrated, so I only did that for triangular points. And the numbers, by the way, are how many of each projectile point, each attribute. No triangular points were basal notch, so that was only for side notch points. And then for side notch points, I used geometric morphometrics to classify the notch heights into 3 points. So this was done so that I could create specific clusters, and that was done in order to facilitate future network analysis. There's other ways with geometric morph metrics that you can get rid of the types altogether, and there are advantages to that. But for this analysis, this is the procedure that I followed. But I didn't analyze all of the points with geometric morphometrics because landmarking the points is quite time-consuming. Processing the points for elliptical Fourier analysis is also time-consuming. And so once you have a big enough training data set, you can teach the computer to do your work for you. And so I trained machine learning models using a pre-trained Resonant 18 model, which is fast to train and quite adaptable. And I did an iterative process where I trained the model, predicted the outcome, manually reviewed the results, retrained the model, and so forth, so that I could be as accurate as possible. The advantage of that is you can test models and the computer can say, I think it's this, and then I can look at it and say, well, computer made a mistake. Or more often, I made the mistake and the computer caught it for it. And the accuracy you can see here for serration is 0.984, for point cluster, 0.951, type 0.94, and for not type 0.953. This was not the test data set accuracy, this was the overall accuracy. So it's somewhat skewed higher, but still rather excellent results for facilitating the analysis. The other advantage is that those machine models can be trained or can be shared so that others can more easily reproduce my work. But do these types have any sort of spatial distribution? Geography, first law of geography is that everything is similar, but near things are more similar. So there should be some sort of spatial clustering, but we need to test that. And so we look at a selection of the most common point types and see if there are any clusters. And indeed, you don't have to look at the details, but you can see that there are some bright spots. These are hexagon bins where I averaged the projectile points from the sites because we have some sites that have tons of data, some sites that don't have much data at all, so that these results weren't skewed. But still, we see some major clusters where certain projectile points are. And then I created a similarity matrix, which is the foundation of a network model, and calculated communities of projectile points using a Louvain cluster method. And you can see that there's a mix of the primary two clusters, community 1 and community 2, across much of the region. And a strong mix of communities in the Roosevelt Basin, which I'll discuss more in the next paper. One of these sites clusters with sites up in the north, the Kayenta region, which seems rather odd until you realize that we have a documented migration from up there into this very region. And have a nice little cluster here. So there is a lot of movement, there's a lot of migration, but we do have some spatial clustering. So it's a mix of what we expected of spatial geography and what we expected to be some movement around. But it's not, but there is also a major spread in the point distribution. They're not all localized to one area. There's a lot of commonality between the points, which we learned from the ArcMatNet model can be problematic for network analysis. So let's see what happens. The last paper was a multi-layer network analysis in the Tonto Basin. So this was from the Roosevelt Projectile Platform Mountain Study, rather, where the Roosevelt Lake depicted here was raised, the dam was raised. And so they did a huge project where they rescued as many sites as they could, boxed up all the artifacts they could, and did a rather excellent study. Here's a slightly more accurate representation of where those sites are. And I analyzed projectile points from those areas and combined them with architectural and ceramic data. We have four clusters: the Klein Mesa, Livingston, Rock Island, and Schoolhouse Mesa clusters. Well, what I wanted to do was also to compare them spatially. So we have a spatial network to see if things are indeed more spatially related. So for the spatial network, we have the Rock Island cluster, which is a single site that's kind of right in the middle of the lake, joining the two. And we have all singly connected components, but some differences between all of them. But to summarize for you, so we're nearly at the end here, promise. We have ceramics and architectural networks that have strong correlations. We have projectile points that are not strongly correlated with the ceramics or the architecture. They are somewhat spatially correlated, but none of the rest are. So that answers the question, is that there are differences in material culture networks. But why? What is the cause? Is it because of the problem with the projectile point analysis? In this case, I don't think so. In fact, I think the cause is because we have good evidence, archaeologically, ethnographically, and otherwise, for who made projectile points, and that would be the men. Not necessarily 100% of the time, I'm sure, but in general, the men made the projectile points. These were also typically matrilocal societies. Men would go to live with their partner. So the architecture and the pottery, which was made, and as far as we can tell, traded by the women, match up to each other, as you would expect from matrilocal societies where the pottery is made by women, but they don't match up to the projectile points. So we have gendered networks, is what it appears. And does this pattern hold long distance? So there's one final short analysis. That's where I looked at sites from the Tonto Basin and from Phoenix and from some northern sites. So we have two spatially separated networks, the northern and the southern. And then we have a ceramic network and a projectile point network. And the projectile point network is much denser. And I think it's suffering from that problem where there's not enough, as much projectile point differentiation, which is the problem we identified for ArcNet. But there is clear differences between the ceramic and point networks. So it does seem that there's this long distance connection between the gendered networks. It is a pattern that holds up locally and long distance. However, one of the more interesting discoveries is that there's this inscription house, which is the red dot at the very top on the map, and the red dot here and there. It is smack dab in the middle of the Tonto Basin networks down here, and the green down below. It's in the wrong place. Very, very much so. It's in the farthest north site, and it's connected to the southern sites. That's because of that Kayenta migration that happened. We have a lot of evidence for it, very strong evidence, but almost all of that evidence has been ceramic and architectural. I haven't been aware of any projectile point evidence for it, but the projectile points match up very well. So we still have no connection there. So what have we learned? Well, material culture networks can represent social networks under the right conditions. We have to be cautious. We have to be careful with how we interpret them, be aware of the specifics of the material culture. But material culture represents different things, different behaviors. We need to be aware of what we're doing and try to use different types of material culture where possible, because we're going to learn different things from them. Also, we've learned that projectile point typologies are difficult, which I don't think is necessarily something new, but even applying new methods can be challenging as well. However, I think that machine learning is the future direction that's best for projectile points, because we can be more objective and more consistent and we can train large databases to help to bring regional typologies together, because we have a lot of projectile points that look the same but are called different things all over the place. And then another thing to remember is just that material culture networks, they're a lot fuzzier than social interaction networks. We just, again, have to be cautious with how we interpret them. So to conclude, right now I am in the process of consulting with various tribes to get their interpretations of my own work. I do have some NAA, which is neutron activation analysis of ceramics, NAA data that I'm working to process, as well as more architectural data, obsidian data, to do a more full multi-layer analysis of a broader data set. And then I do have students working to help me build a projectile point machine learning data set. And with that, I can expand the data even further and see how these relationships hold up across vaster spaces. So thank you very much. Appreciate my funding and the collections I was able to get, and so many more people. Thank you very much.